Is MMA a late blooming sport? So there's been a lot of talk recently about the ages in the UFC and speculation as to what age MMA fighters peak and eventually fall off. And I think this has stemmed from Volk's fight with Ilya this Saturday, which highlights the age gap between the two competitors and really reminded us that Volk has been hitting his stride and been on top of his game in his early to mid 30s. And it isn't just Volk, it's practically everyone on the top of their division. This is the current age of champs today, with damn near everyone being 30 or older and the average age of champions being 32.75 or basically 33 years old. Also, is it just me or does it freak you out that Alex Pereira is a year older than John Jones? Anyways, if you go to practically any year, the average age of champions always clears 30 years old and usually hovers around 33. And of course, every year, someone on Reddit asked the question as to why it seems like the prime of UFC fighters is around 33, which is vastly older than the prime of most other sports. Take my second favorite sport, basketball. If you look at the last 20 MVPs, the average age of an MVP is basically 25 years old, and you would have to go all the way back to the 2005-2006 season to find an MVP at or above the age of 30, and granted, it was Steve Nash at 31. And speaking of basketball, this past weekend I went to a Wizards game to see my Sixers get the W, and I got my tickets using Game Time. Game Time is a fast, easy-to-use ticket marketplace where you can buy and sell tickets to the most popular live events like sports, music, and theater. Game Time is the only ticketing app that gives you peace of mind with your purchase. When I bought my Wizards tickets on the app, I saw the exact view I was getting from my seats, and I really like that they show you your total price up front so you know you're getting a good deal before you check out. Speaking of getting your money right, Game Time is obsessed with finding ways to help you save money. They can show you straight up the best deals in certain zones, flash deals, and rare finds. Also, the Game Time guarantee means you will always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOVEFIGHTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOVEFIGHTS, LOVEFIGHTS for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And this is obviously consistent amongst all other major sports, with the top or arguably best players in their respective sport hovering around their mid to late 20s and none of them being above the age of 30. And this trend seems to be consistent with most, if not all, the studies on age and peak athletic performance, which seems to conclude athletes tend to peak in their late 20s. So of course, the question is, why is the average age of a UFC champion 33 years old? Why does it seem like 33 is the prime for MMA fighters? And before I begin, I also wanted to note the elephant in the room that MMA On Point kind of beat me to this video, but I swear this video did not originate from that video. It actually stemmed from this Reddit post about 2 weeks ago, and I had already started this script about a week ago, so I swear on everything, it was just parallel thinking. But if you haven't checked it out, this video is an amazing deep dive on the ages of UFC fighters and when they decline, and they show other trends they found regarding the age of UFC fighters using a data set they made. The only gripe I have with this video is that Tommy Toehold made his own data set and cleaned it with Microsoft Excel, which is disgusting. Mr. Toehold, if you're somehow watching this video, let's meet up and I'll give you some basic Python and a data set off Kaggle so you don't have to do data analytics like a pilgrim. Anyways, I will be using some of the numbers and trends in that video, but in this video, I just wanted to take it a step further. I don't just want to show the numbers, but I want to additionally try to explain the numbers and give insight as to why the prime of UFC fighters is so vastly older than the prime of other athletes. And a little teaser, I wanted to explain why I see this number going down to that 28-year-old mark and aligning with most other sports. So I asked you guys why that 33-year-old mark seems like the prime of MMA fighters, and there seems to be a consensus answer. 33 is that magic number and perfect intersection of when fighters have enough fighting experience but are still on the tail end of their peak athletic performance, and this was my knee-jerk reaction as well. If we could somehow objectively graph experience with athletic performance over the age of fighters, I would assume it would look something like this. Athletic performance would rise and probably peak at around 28, while experience would obviously consistently go up as a fighter continually fights. And the crossroads of these two lines would probably be around 33. And the guys at MMA On Point seem to agree with their findings, showing 33 seems to be the peak age of fighters in terms of win rate, in title bouts having an expected win rate of 52.5%, before 33 and dropping to 40.8% after 33. With all the numbers and reasoning suggesting that 33 is the peak of MMA fighters, or at least UFC champions, which are the representatives of the best MMA has to offer, then we can also derive that fighting isn't necessarily about athleticism, it's more about skill, of course relative to other sports, which I would think would be a huge shock to all of us. Let's play the if I can somehow objectively measure stuff game again. Imagine I had another graph that could represent sports based on the balance of skill and athleticism needed to succeed in that sport. If a sport leaned towards one side, that meant that pure skill within that sport mattered more to success, and towards another side, that meant athleticism mattered more, and one could succeed based on their pure athleticism. If I could somehow make this graph, I would imagine it would look something like this with the major sports. And initially, I would think that athletes in the UFC would be somewhere here in the middle. But given the numbers we just saw, dare I say it, MMA fighters might be closer to golf than football. And I'm talking both types of football here, in terms of skill to athleticism ratio, which would actually kind of make sense. The philosophy behind the effectiveness of a lot of martial arts is to be able to dominate somebody with the mastery of the art and not necessarily athleticism. This is obviously shown in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where the whole idea is to be able to masterfully submit a bigger opponent with technique rather than brute force, which was first showcased to the world at UFC 1. And this is why many of us have significantly smaller guys being able to dominate a giant, strong, and athletic 260 beast like Bradley Martin because of their mastery in martial arts and not necessarily because of their athleticism. So end of story, right? We found that the average age of a UFC champion is 33, and that's essentially the peak of MMA fighters, because this is the perfect crossroads between experience and athleticism in a sport where skill, something built through experience, seems to matter much more than athleticism. So this all makes sense, right? Now, what if I were to say all of the things I just reasoned might actually be all wrong, or at least not the end all be all? Let's look at the ages of champions again. And there's something I left out: the ages these guys debuted. The average age of these champions debuting is already basically 25 years old, meaning when these champions are in their athletic prime, they are literally just getting into the UFC and finally getting the chance to gain more experience against the absolute best in their sport. If you couple this with the fact that most fighters fight just once or twice a year, then it's just simply impossible for anyone to have enough experience in their athletic prime. Compare this with most other sports where athletes at the age of 18 can compete with the very best hundreds of times across a season or tournament, and it's pretty easy to see why most athletes can peak in their performance in their athletic prime with the experience they have. So what I'm saying is 33 isn't some fixed magical number in fighting where athletic performance and experience combine perfectly. 33 is simply just a consequence of the UFC's business structure and basically controls the experience part of our equation. The UFC most often signs the best talent out of other smaller fighting organizations only after they have proven themselves to be championship material in those organizations, which could take years into someone's athletic prime. This is obviously shown by the frequency of ages of fighters in the UFC, with that frequency peaking at 30. So of course, more fighters at 30 literally means that champions are probably going to be at around 30. It's as simple as that, but obviously I can't say that in the beginning of the video, or this would be a minute long. But now the real question is, why does the UFC only sign guys in their mid to late 20s? Why can't they get guys in their early 20s or even late teens like other sports? And why is it practically impossible to sign young talent like Raul Rosas Jr. right now? The irony is, the UFC can't sign young talent because the sport of MMA itself is way too young. We've always heard stories of young phenoms in other sports that start their respective sport when they were kids and mastered that sport up until their teens or early 20s when they entered the big leagues. When's the last time we've heard of a young MMA phenom? All of the champs I showed you didn't start out with MMA explicitly. Most started with kickboxing, some with wrestling, but none, I don't think, set out to be the best MMA fighter when they were kids. Thus, some, if not most of them, had to dominate and train in another sport before making that transition to MMA, and had to dominate in another promotion before the UFC. And of course, that takes time, which means that we won't see good MMA talent until probably someone's mid-20s, which means most fighters that can stick around in the UFC are in their 30s, which ultimately means really the only window they can be champion is around 33. But with the explosive growth and popularity of high-level MMA in the form of the UFC, this could change. We could start seeing more kids coming out with an MMA base and actually starting out with MMA. We could probably see more young MMA phenoms and talent good enough to be in the UFC at their young 20s, which would also mean the average age of UFC fighters would decrease. And finally, we could probably see champions perform at their athletic peaks in their mid to late 20s. Anyways, what do you guys think? Is the age of UFC fighters going to go down in the next 5 to 10 years with the popularity of the UFC and MMA? Will we finally see champions perform at their athletic peak? Will that number of 33 go down? Let me know in the comments below. It's very interesting to see trends in the UFC, especially when it comes to age, and I'll see you in the next week. Peace.